Good morning, everybody. I'm Scott Brabrand, Executive Director for the Virginia Association of School Superintendents. Happy Monday, everyone. I'm here with Amy Griffin, Deputy Executive Director, and we're glad to have you here this morning for what promises to be a very informative discussion around the student funding formula consideration that came out of JLARC, as well as understanding our current staffing-driven funding formula that we use here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. I hope everyone had a great weekend, and we're glad to have you here today. We're going to have two presentations today. First, we're going to hear about the student-driven funding formula from Dr. Marguerite Roza, who is a professor at Georgetown University and the director of the Edunomics lab there. One of the things Dr. Roza has been able to do, working with the Hunt Institute, she briefed members of the General Assembly just a couple of months ago, including the respective chairs of the Education Committee in both the House and Senate, on the student funding formula as it has occurred in other states. So we're very, very pleased to have her expertise with us today. And I want to be clear up front. So we have Dr. Roza. We also have a stranger to no one here on the call, Mr. Jim Regimbal, who has come to many VASS conferences and given you the latest budget updates. And he will give you what I believe, frankly, in my 30 years of education, is the most comprehensive understanding of our current formula that I've ever seen. I wish I had it when I was a superintendent starting over 15 years ago. So you're really in for a great informative session. Finally, before I begin, just a couple of things right up front. We have not taken, VASS has not taken a position for or against a student funding formula. The session today is information only, so we can gain collective awareness and understanding of the pros and cons associated with both a student-driven and a staff-driven formula. We have asked, and there is budget language to form a study group to explore the student funding formula and bring back recommendations to the General Assembly next year. And we have asked Dr. Coons to have VASS collaboration and VASS participation on such a study group. So no decisions are being made today. No decisions are being made really for some time. This is for us to begin to have a collective understanding, and then we'll work with the administration, with VDOE, to be a part of additional discussions throughout this year and part of any final recommendations that might go to the General Assembly in the next session. Finally, as each presents, at the end of their presentation, we'll have a brief opportunity for some Q&A. I have a few questions perhaps preloaded, but if you have a question, if you would put it in the chat, Amy will be moderating the chat, and we'll share that question or two with you. Again, it'll be dependent on the amount of time we have left. Each has about a half hour, and we want to leave room in that half hour for a few questions. So we're at 10:04, just about our first 5 minutes in. We're glad to have you here today. And again, sit back and prepare to be really informed and engaged in a very, very important consideration for how we fund K-12 education in the Commonwealth of Virginia. So without further ado, it's my honor and pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Marguerite Roza. Dr. Roza, thank you for being here this morning.
Thank you for having me. I'm putting up my slides here. Let's see if I can get it to do its thing. Hopefully you can see them.
Absolutely.
Okay, excellent. So essentially, I'm going to take you through. So we're a research center. We don't have any stake in the Virginia formula, but we study them across the country and in different districts, different states, how they've come together, and have learned a lot as we've gone. We've been doing this for decades, really. So I'm going to bring you some perspective just on how to kind of categorize and think about the funding formulas. And I would say that as we travel around the country, most would agree on a set of desired features of any state education funding system. They'd like it to be simple and transparent so that, and they'd like it to feel equitable for students. They want it to be financially sustainable over time, outcomes focused, so we're getting the maximum value for the dollar, and flexible and adaptable. And the thinking there is really that leaders need to believe their school system is treating them fairly. So if school district leaders don't feel like it's fair, then they don't do the most work to deliver value for kids. They spend their time worrying about it being unfair. So it needs to be simple and transparent, and they need to understand it. It's got to be equitable for students. That means there's got to be more money available for districts that are serving higher needs students. It needs to be financially sustainable, so it needs to rely on revenue streams that are stable over time. Outcomes focused, so it means the dollars are going out in a way that drives districts to deliver the maximum value for the kids that they serve. So we really have to think about, like, what are we getting from the money, not just how much is going out, and flexible and adaptable over time. And this is when a lot of districts don't look at it. It's essentially, will the formula still work in the year 2025? And I don't know if you guys can hear that, but there is a fire alarm going off in my building right now. So I'm going to keep going. I think it might be a blip because there's construction going on next door. So I'm going to just keep going unless you interrupt me and tell me otherwise, or somebody marches in and says I have to come out of the building. So we'll see.
We understand. Keep on going, Dr. Roza. Thank you.
Of course, right? So will the formula still work in the year 2025? And the reason 2050. The reason we ask about that is that it's very hard for states to change their funding formulas. On average, funding formulas stick around for maybe 30 years. And that means whatever you do today still has to work in a few decades from now. And we don't really know what schooling will look like in a few decades from now, but we do know there will be kids. And so if we're going to structure it around something, we need that to be structured in a way that's still flexible to deliver schooling in years we can't even imagine what schooling looks like. So a few key decisions that every state would need to make, and we're going to talk about what these are and what they mean for a student-based formula. But the first is, how should we structure the allocations? What adjustments should we make? Whether to involve local revenue, whether there are constraints and accountability, and a few more features I'll tell you about in a minute. But the first one is the one we're talking about a lot today. And that would be potentially shifting to a model that is a student-based allocation model, where the dollars are structured, allotted around the number of students or the number of student types. Alternate models are these staffing-based or resource-based formulas, categorical or program allocations. A few states have other, where some of their money is structured around a hold harmless or last year's amount or things like that, or reimbursements, or a hybrid model. So it sounds like I'm going to be asked to leave the building. So I'm going to leave my computer on, and maybe we can be flexible and switch it back over, if that makes sense, to James. And then I will stop sharing and come back in as soon as they decide we're not really in a fire. Does that work?
No, that works, Dr. Roza. We understand flexibility in this world. So
very sorry about that. I will be back as soon as possible.
All right. Thank you. Well, Jim, why don't we go ahead and let you, we'll pause on hearing the student formula, and you can give our folks an update on the current system that we've had for decades in Virginia that's staffing driven.
Okay, let's see here. Is that working?
Yes.
All right, folks. All right, so we're going to go from Dr. Roza's description of a simple type of system, student-based, more flexible, to our current, little more complex system of a staffing-based approach to funding K-12, which is what Virginia has. There actually is a few other elements sometimes thrown in, of hold harmlesses and things like that she discussed as well. But first, I want to, in the Constitution, we are supposed to have a high quality education that's a program that's established and maintained. But the key point I want to make here is the standards of quality are subject to determination by the General Assembly. They are in charge of what is defined as the standards of quality. So everyone be aware, they define it, they can change it, and they do. Actually, the standards of quality are pretty much continually modified over time by having changing standards put in them, for example. So, and there's a couple other funds. It's mostly general funds from the state that provide aid to local school divisions through the standards of quality. But there's also literary funds that are used as well. And literary funds are fines, fees, forfeitures, unclaimed properties in the main. And then lottery proceeds, you're aware of that. So lottery proceeds are very similar to how general funds are used. So those are the sources of funding besides federal funds and local funds. The standards are in the Code of Virginia, and we're going to be talking about Standard 2 in the main, which are the staffing standards, which essentially get to the standards of quality. So this is a pictorial model of what the standards of quality look like and how it's funded. So if you look at the top, the inputs to the SOQ model are the staffing ratios I'm gonna show you in a minute, and there's many of them. The number of students by school division is very important because it's paid, the standards of quality are paid on a per pupil basis. So it depends on how many students you have. And prevailing salaries are calculated as well. And prevailing salaries are not the weighted average across the state. It's a formula that uses every school division's salaries by type and gives them the same weight as every other school division, except for if you're a 2 standard deviations, basically higher than everyone else, or 2 standard or lower than everyone else, you're lopped off, and whatever's left in the middle is what the prevailing salary is. It's not the weighted average. So a small school division can be weighted the same as a large one if you're not above or below that 2 standards of quality. And then you have fringe benefits thrown in as well. It looks like Dr. Rose is back. I don't know how you want to handle this at this point, Scott, but if you want to let her continue, I can exit. I'm not sure how you want to handle it.
Well, I mean, given that it was just a short beginning, this is a nice teaser. Do you want to finish just with this slide, Jim, and then we'll go back to Dr. Roza just to explain this. This is a very key slide for this formula that we currently have. You just want to finish explaining that, and then we'll go back over to Dr. Roza and another thing.
I'm going to give you more detail on this, but you can see all the inputs. Then you have support costs that go in and support positions. For example, you can think of the superintendent as a support position. You can think of your transportation, your other equipment, et cetera. That would be support costs. And then inflation has to be blended into this as well. You have to bring it up to the current time as best you can. So, and then it's allocated in different ways, and you know the composite index. And I'll stop here and let her get back into hers. There you go.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Jim.
that's really sorry about that, everybody.
Okay.
Gonna do drills all day long, and they didn't give us any heads up, so that was discouraging. But anyway, so yes, as you probably got a sense of it, Virginia's formula, which is typo on formula there, is a hybrid. It's a combination of the above. And so it's got a few pieces of certainly at least 3 of these types. And that makes it a little bit hard to understand. I think most districts can't figure out on their own how they got the amount of money that they got. And they probably don't know the amount that they got. So that's what makes it kind of confusing. And there are elements of all of these. I would say your next big decision is especially if you're in a student-based allocation, what adjustments are you making? Here is California's formula. This was in 2014. The numbers are higher now. But essentially in grades K through 3, you get $7,000, $557 per student, plus an extra 20% for each student who's a limited English student or in poverty or in foster youth. So the numbers are right there. So you could basically take your enrollment and figure out how much money you get. And that is the formula. That's a whole formula right there. And the numbers adjust up each year. They've actually increased the weights substantially since then. So there's, even higher numbers down here for these high needs student populations. California went from a program and staffing type model to the student-based model, in part to make the money much more flexible, turn over some of that decision-making authority back to districts, and really drive equity so that the higher needs populations were getting more money over time. So if you're instead in one of the other models, let's say a staffing model, you have decisions to make about what student-teacher ratios, class sizes, positions per school district, per school, pay levels, how you're going to do all the math on that. And that leaves the legislature to come up with a stereotypical school or some sort of state-decided mix of resources that it thinks each school should have. And that is the one where we worry over time that it's not flexible, in the sense that the way we deliver schooling over time might change as we learn different things about students, or what works or what doesn't, or we have technological innovations or things like that. And so this puts a lot of that decision-making authority back at the legislature on a regular basis to modify. In categorical or program allocations, obviously the legislature is going to need to decide what program types we're funding, who's eligible, what are the cost of each programs. And so you're having, again, a lot of the decision-making around how money gets spent to be decided by the legislature, not the districts. And it kind of, it has a effect of imposing a set of constraints on districts, even when districts don't have to adhere to those. We find in states that districts operate as though they do, because there's a state expectation almost for these kinds of inputs. And then the next one, how and whether to involve local revenue. Obviously, in almost every state, local revenue plays a pretty big role in funding schools. And ideally, what we're doing is involving local revenue because it has some benefit to raise our spending in a state. There's not enough money at the state level generally to fund schools, and taxpayers are more willing to fund their schools from local money. So you kind of want to have an intentional mix there. So we say the goal is to both tap and tame local funds. When you're tapping them, it's because taxpayers are more willing to grow local money. Local money competes with fewer priorities, tends to be more stable over time. And then yet we want to tame it, meaning that the state wants to be able to manage that money in a way that it doesn't drive wild inequities. And we know there's uneven property values and uneven appetite for local funds. So when we look at a model that does both of those things, certainly unregulated local funding would tap it, but not tame it. We could cap local funds, and that would tame them, meaning we restricted them, and so they can't drive too much inequity, but maybe we're missing some of the full value of those. We could count some local effort toward the state allocation, and that's what we're seeing most states do. That's a both tap and tame strategy, and I'll show you what that looks like in just a moment. The state could match local effort to create an equal yield per pupil. That's a tap and tame strategy, and I'll do an illustration of that in a moment as well. Or we could do Robin Hood policies, where the state actually takes the local money back to the state and redistributes it. This exists in Texas and another one of the New England states, and it's both a tap and tame strategy. But at that point, it essentially creates a new category called wildly unpopular, and in that sense, it's unstable with voters, because people really don't like to see a local tax get paid back to the state and redistributed. They're fine with some state taxes, but if it looks like it's local recapture in some sort of way, it makes people really mad. So So we think of this C and D as the most stable options. So I'm going to show you what that looks like. I'm happy to share these slides, but I think the visualization here will make more sense. So this is a visualization we did on Idaho, and this was a couple years ago, so the dollar amounts are kind of low. But these are all the Idaho districts. And essentially, if everybody is expected to tax at a particular rate, in Idaho, it would be 3.5 mil. We know it would produce a different amount per student by district, right? Because down here, these really low property wealth communities, and even at a 3.5 mil tax amount, you're just not getting that much money, right? Because they don't have a lot of property values. And on a per pupil basis, it's like getting blood from a stone. On the other areas over here, McCall is a fancy neighborhood on a lake with sort of resorty. Not surprising, really can collect a lot of money, even at that tax rate, just generate a lot of cash up there, over $8,000 a kid. So what the state was thinking about doing in Idaho, which is what a lot of states are doing now, is they're saying, let's assume you're going to collect that tax amount. It's the same tax amount in every community. We'll just make the assumption you're going to collect it, and the state is going to give you the difference. So the state is basically going to give more money to some of these districts that have lower taxes and are lower, can generate lower dollar amounts, and give less money to the communities that can generate more. And the upside there is that it's essentially using the local money to stretch the state dollar and still have one formula that guides all districts. That's that first option. And the second option that we said is, well, if you want to encourage districts to even raise more money, you can create a match up to a certain amount. So if you tax yourself at, say, another 1.5 mil, maybe you can get a match from the state, and that'll generate at least, maybe another $1,000. And so they're not going to match everybody, because some of these districts are off the grid here, but that allows us to really create an incentive for communities to raise potentially even more. So those are those two models on how you still have a student-based formula, and that student-based formula is still a part and parcel of your of evolving your local revenue there. So let's see, this arrow is supposed to move down here. Sorry, I kind of ran out of the room in a hurry, but so we're talking about constraints and accountability. Here, what we're doing is whether or not, after the state gives its money to the district, whether it then says, we are going to tell you how to spend it. And honestly, the state could do that with any of these formulas. But what we see with student-based formulas is that the state tends to expect to allow more flexibility. We've signaled which kids we're worried about: high poverty kids, English language learners, foster kids. We've given you extra money for those. And now we plan to give you more flexibility at the local level. Usually with a staffing-based model, the tendency is to think more here that there's prescription there. So that's another decision to make. Here's another decision. These are sort of more minor decisions in the end, is whether or not you're going to have data systems, tools, and trainings to equip local leaders to be able to use their money and deliver those outcomes, maximize the value, those outcomes for students, to stay focused on whether the choices they're making are lifting students and adding more value for students. So you need the data systems and training, et cetera, to do that. And then the last one, and I know there's a lot of interest here, is what do you do about transitioning to a new formula? So generally, we advise clarify how much each district will gain or lose. Then make sure there's flexibility in the transition, because different districts are going to manage that transition differently. And then consider a temporary hold harmless agreement so that districts aren't actually losing cash along the way. And so that a temporary hold harmless sort of says that any district that got X amount of dollars last year will continue as we phase in the new formula with new dollars to get all our districts up to where they need to be. So that's our basic outline. We train on these models and allow districts to look at other formulas in other states and model them for their own in our certificate in Ed Finance. So if that's really of interest to anyone, we would encourage you to come. It's the next cohort is in DC in September 24th, 25. So I think what I'll do is stop there and see, do we want to see if there's questions or do we want to finish the other
Sure,
presentation?
we'll see if there's questions. You can start to put your questions in the chat for Amy. I think 2 quick questions, Dr. Roza, just to get it going. How long is that transition runway to hold harmless that you've seen in other states? And many of our districts in Virginia are smaller. Is there a factor that can be put in for smaller divisions that may have economies of scale issues for positions? Those may be 2 very popular questions, and then we'll have, please place in the chat some others, and we'll do a few minutes with that, maybe 5 minutes.
So I think the hold harmless usually will go as long as it takes to catch other districts up. So in California, the state passed a new state tax at the time they adopted their new formula. And so they thought it would take a 5-year phase in to get all districts up to where their most well-funded districts were. And they got there a lot faster because they got this new tax formula. So I think generally speaking, you want to have it be temporary, but ideally you're bringing a lot more money in the system and getting everybody up to the desired amount sooner rather than later. You don't want a hold harmless formula to linger around for a decade or so. That just sort of defeats the purpose and makes people bitter.
Okay.
In terms of small districts, ideally so in some states, by the way, don't have any offset for small districts and some do. And the ones that do, if you're in a pure student-based model, what you would want to create a weight in is around a student, not a district. But when students are spread out, like in a rural community, there are more costs with that. So transportation costs that might be harder to get people to work there and things like that. So we see some districts saying we have an extra weight for students who are in rural or low population density areas. The one thing about weighting a district just for its size is over time, some of the smaller districts feel pressure from the state to combine. And the state says, I want to get rid of this weight. And if I combine you 2 districts, I can get rid of this weight. So I think it's a double-edged sword there, where if districts would be better off almost sharing some services, maybe some special ed services, some back office services, in a way to maintain their independence if they are small districts in, well-populated areas. So that's why I would suggest, if you want to do a weight for sparsity or rural districts, or rural students, things like that.
Amy, you were monitoring the chat. Anything to share out of the chat for Dr. Roza?
Yes, we have one question from Olwyn. What about special education? Is it considered in formulas?
So, and that varies by state, but generally speaking, the trend is to put special education in the student-based formula. And the reason why is that districts are reacting to special ed more flexibly over time. They're finding more creative and opportunistic ways to deliver special ed services. So in Louisiana, for instance, there is a special ed is in the formula, and there are 4 categories of special ed students, and then a 5th category where the costs are really high and you sort of negotiate them one-off with the state. But it's sort of like low, medium, high, and very high or something like that. And there's a dollar amount with each of those. And then an appeals process, because there's always something unique with special ed. And then there are other states that have as many as 10 or more special ed categories, each with dollar amounts. And so they're basically like, if you have one of these kids, you get this dollar amount to deliver those services.
I don't see any other questions in chat.
Okay. Well, Dr. Roza, we're glad to have you here today. If you're available to stay on for the remaining 30 minutes,
Absolutely.
we'd love to have you in case there's some additional questions generated. But so thankful for you to be here, and we look forward to working with you throughout this next year as Virginia considers this very important decision. So thank
Yes,
you.
and one last thing is I am happy to share this slide deck. I feel like I did not do a particularly good job of delivering it today because of all the noise in the background here. So I apologize for that, but I'm happy to email it out or answer any questions.
Yeah, send it to Amy. We'll be getting it out to everybody in the next day or two for sure. And we really hope this is the beginning of a relationship with you to talk through this as we continue. And again, thank you for being so flexible this morning, and sorry for the difficulties you had.
Yeah, no, my apologies. James will probably fill in everything I glossed over. So thanks.
Well, hang tight. If you can stay with us the next half hour, that'd be great. There may be a chance at the end for a couple of dual questions. So Jim, we'll turn it over to you and get back to that SOQ formula slide.
Okay.
And go from there.
Dr. Roza did a great job of explaining student-based formula. It was very understandable to me. Virginia's, as she said, it is kind of a hybrid. It's I would call it mostly student-based, but there are elements of categorical, and there are incentive funds that are thrown in there. It can be hold harmlesses in various years thrown in. So we do have some hybrid elements definitely as well. But the basic SOQ process is described here, and I was talking about it, where you have all these elements, moving in that I'll talk about later, that the General Assembly can make changes to, and they do over time. All of these factors, other than the number of students, have had changes made to them over time by the General Assembly, who controls what the definition is. But ultimately, after all these factors come into play, they get brought into a per pupil amount that then gets you take that per pupil amount, multiply by your projected enrollment, and then the first element is you get a basic aid amount of money sent to you. And the first category that's used to fill that basic aid bucket is your sales tax based on school age population, the number of school age population kids in your locality, not your ADM, but the total number of school age kids that determine a sales tax amount out of 1 1/8 cents of the state sales tax gets first to fill the bucket. Then what's left is divided up by the state share, and then your local composite index decides what the state share and your local share is. And I'll talk about the composite index again. But then there's many other accounts that also are funded in the SOQ, and then in other incentive and categorical that are also have the composite index applied, which decides your state share and local share. So that's sort of this Virginia's way, that local composite in it, deciding that of each school division's ability to pay for its total pot of money that the state decides you are required to do. I will say a further thing. I think in the flexibility side in Virginia, every locality basically spends way more than what the state has determined is your pot of standards of quality that you need to do. You spend way more than that. And so I guess that's the way you have your own flexibility. You're able to put any amount of money beyond what the state requires into your school system, and you can use that mostly in any way you want. So there is that flexible nature, but it's your money that decides which you can use it with. So sort of reiterating what that last slide was telling you. So you have your number of funded positions based on the staffing ratios, which are very complex. I'm going to show you. And then you multiply that by your enrollment, and then you multiply that by the salaries that are determined by the state that they're going to pay, these prevailing salaries, and then plus the benefit costs like your VRS and your health insurance costs. And that gets your personnel costs. Your non-personal costs are, again, your projected enrollment multiplied what your prevailing support costs are. In other words, that same methodology of determining salaries is determined what support costs are. They look at every school division, and then they take they lop off the high and the low, and then what's in the middle is determined the average support cost by school division, and you multiply that by projected enrollment. Now that has had a cap put on it, which has been in place since 2009. So you can think where that support cap has been put in place at 24 positions per 100 is been in place. It was 26 positions per 100, but it's been moved up, and so they're close to getting rid of it. It's still there. Again, the ratios, these stats can only be amended by the General Assembly. Prevailing salaries and benefits and prevailing support costs can be amended by the General Assembly as well, and those all are re-benchmarked biennially based on historical costs and inflation adjustments and salary increases that have taken place in the past. So that's done every 2 years. The re-benchmarking was just done for the introduced bill. They've re-benchmarked these costs, these salaries, and brought them up mainly by inflation. And then you have your enrollment updated. That's done annually. And the final true-up, the final payment that's made to you is actually based on your March 30 enrollment. There's estimates done in the fall, and then they can be updated again for the General Assembly. But the final payment is done based on your March 30 count of your students. So this slide shows you what these complex staffing standards are. And you can see that, and mainly, as I said, they go into the basic aid calculation, but then you have other accounts. For example, the gifted program, the ESL, English language program. There's various programs that are incentive programs for resource teachers, such as reading specialists. You have IT. Ones I want to highlight, and one of the reasons why JLARC, which we're going to talk about later, the JLARC report, said that the state needed to improve and expand its standards of quality is because they don't cover all the staff that you employ. In fact, they only cover, they counted 2/3 of your staff. And to give you an idea, teacher aides are highlighted. The state only covers one kindergarten aide, one teacher for kindergarten for every 24 students. But there is teacher aides throughout your schools, throughout the various classrooms, not just kindergarten. In fact, out of the 21,000 teacher aides employed, there's only 2,800 that are actually covered under the standards of quality and that get paid for by the state. Assistant principals are the same way. There's about 2,000 that are covered out of the total 8,000. You can see any school with below 600 students there's no assistant principals counted by the standards of quality at all. So you can see why you employ lots more assistant principals than is covered by the standards of quality. And so those are some of the reasons why you have to put in a lot more money. And then JLARC also said that the state underfunds K-12 by a lot. So this is the support position standards. You can see, there's specialized student support. They get 3 of those positions per 1,000. And then all other support positions, such as your central office, your executives, your operation maintenance, your transportation, clerical, you get 24 positions per 1,000 students. It was 26.3 pre-2009. It had been as low as 17 when they capped it originally in 2009. Over the last couple of years, that's been brought up to 24. But you were severely underfunded compared to what you were pre-2009. And so that 26, so we're now at 24, and the General Assembly, I'm sure, is considering that issue during this session to actually completely uncap it. These are the salaries that are in the state budget that are the prevailing salaries. You can see by category how much they've been brought up since 2012-14. And the biennium we're in is 22-24. And you can see in the introduced bill for 24-26, there has been significant increases because the cost of you paying for teachers and the state raises that were applied have required the prevailing salaries to be increased by over 12% for the upcoming biennium. So they do move up, but as I said earlier, they're not a weighted average across the state. And if you took an actual weighted average, which weighted the Fairfaxes, Henricos, Prince Williams, Loudons, with all the teachers they had, you would have a significantly higher actually prevailing salary than you see here. That's one of the ways the state controls costs. And also, one of the big reasons JLARC said that the state underfunds K-12 is that prevailing salaries are underfunded. So I'll let you look at this at your leisure. This is how the basic aid is calculated, going through the steps of what I said, using prevailing salaries and all the staffing standards, and then support positions, and then and also non-personal costs, materials, fuel, supplies, and how that goes down to a per pupil amount that is then first paid for by the sales tax and then the rest by general funds. But it's all done on a per pupil basis, so it depends on how many students you actually have to how much you actually get. So your number of students is important to how much you're going to totally get from basic aid and for a lot of these other categories. Other SOQ accounts, we're still in the standards of quality. You can see how textbooks are funded, how gifted teachers, vocational teachers. These are all separate categories beyond basic aid that you get in the standards of quality. There's also an at-risk category, prevention, intervention, remediation. That's basically for at-risk students. You can see it varies how many teachers you get per student, and it's also based on failure rates. So again, very complex. I can't even get into special ed teacher because it's a complex set of 60 ratios that goes into how much funding you get for special education. And English language, and all these categories have been moved around over the years. You know, the General Assembly will at times they will increase them, and in bad, economic times they may cut them back, as they did with support costs. So the General Assembly has control over all these funding categories. So this is a reiteration of the standards of quality programs I've described quickly, and you can see the total dollar amounts and then what the required local share is. Okay, remember, the state pays 55% on average of all the standards of quality counted costs. Now, remember, that's not really what you're paying. As I always described, JLARC has described how the state really undercounts what these total should be. But this is the official standards of quality in the current years. You can see they put forward 7.3 billion as a state share. That's 55% of the total standards of quality. You put in 45%, and that's that 4.39. That's your required share, net of the sales tax. So you got to net the sales tax out before you get the 55-45, because the composite index is not applied to the sales tax. That's why you see an NA next to that, nor remedial summer school. Those are the two categories that the LCI is not applied to. Now you can go back when I send this to you guys. You can look at every one of those categories and see how they're officially derived at, how you get. I included this in here. I'm not going to go through it all right now. I've said for years that, and this is a slide I developed and I've used for a long time, that the state underfunds the numbers of positions that you actually employ. Therefore, the staffing ratios undercount the needed personnel. And then you have the prevailing salary cost issue. And at the very bottom, you see every school division basically puts in way more money than they're required. Some of them, many of them, exceeding 100% of their required local effort that school divisions have to put in to actually fund their divisions beyond what the state requires. So the JLARC recommendations that came out last summer kind of feed after that last slide I just showed you that I've been saying for years, that the JLARC found that the state only recognizes 2/3 of the actual staff employed, that the state needs to recognize the lack of economies of scale in small schools and more support needed there. Prevailing salaries are not up to snuff because they're not really a weighted average. They didn't restore the cuts in 2009. They've started to raise up the support cap, getting rid of that, but they haven't applied restored certain non-personal expenses like transportation, bus costs. That federal deduct calculation was put in, which actually reduced the rebenchmarking by hundreds of millions because of all the ESSER money that was temporarily put in during the pandemic. So that reduced the amount of rebenchmarking by 338 million coming forward. And of course, there's inadequate support for lots of different kinds of special kids that need special education needs. And then they also proposed a much different cost of living model, which is not just Northern Virginia, but any school division that has higher cost of living than the statewide average would get a boost. And then finally, JLARC talked about a re-benchmarking process that really covered real-time costs, because the way it works now, they bring it up only to the start of the biennium. And so that's a 2-year period. So during that biennium, the costs for the state pays for, that's based on historical costs, doesn't really cover real-time costs. And JLARC said, look, you need to figure out a way to cover real-time costs, not just to the start of the biennium. So they did, as Dr. Roza was describing, did recommend that we look at moving to a student-based funding model, much simpler, much easier to understand, and more flexible, and and not a moving target like what's going on right now. So these are the and I'm not going to go through all these. I'm going to give you a little summary at the end, but these are all the non-mandatory, and that all you school divisions, you do participate in these because you want that state aid here. And so, but there's a whole list of them. You can see some hold harmless. You see the preschool, Virginia preschool for 3- and 4-year-olds. You see the at-risk program that gives money to more money to school divisions with more higher at-risk kids. But there's lots of various programs in these, they call it incentive funds. This is not standards of quality, but it is state K-12 funding programs. And then there's categorical programs. And then you see the whole slew of lottery programs, which are funded with that $800 million plus lottery amount that goes in. They use that and fund these programs. Okay, it's like general funds, but it goes in. For example, they now take and send it out on an ADM basis. You see that infrastructure and operations per pupil fund. That's basically, there's a set amount for everyone at a base level, but then if you have more students, you get more money based on a per pupil amount. So that directly comes out of lottery funds. Again, a lot of complexity here. And then these are all these categorical programs that are direct to a specific program. There's a whole list of them here. Teach for America in there, for example. Virginia Holocaust, there's lots of different school-based funding directly to direct programs that the General Assembly funds. So you can get to the bottom line. That 7.3 billion in the standards of quality rises to 10.1 in total, the state aid for 24. And most of those extra programs do require the composite index applied to them, so that you do your share, which you have to pay to receive those funds. Most of those do have the composite index applied, so that would determine how much you have to put in to get some of those other funds. The biggest of these non-SOQ funds is the infrastructure and operation per pupil fund out of the lottery, the VPI program, Virginia Preschool Initiative, which funds 3- and 4-year-olds. A lot of those classrooms are in your schools. The at-risk add-on, which has moved up a lot recently. It's now a funding program that provides, it's a complicated formula that goes from 1 to 36% of your total number of free lunch kids, depending on your concentration. So if you're a very concentrated, let's say you're a Petersburg, which is basically 100% free lunch, then you will get 36% boost per kid per base, 36% of your higher base than your regular basic aid. It'll get bumped up for each of those kids. And so you'll get the very highest share. If you're like a Falls Church, the very other end, where you have hardly any free lunch kids, you're only going to get a 1% boost. So that's how that works. And it's interpolated in between there. Again, a complicated formula for funding at risk as opposed to what a student-based might be. And then you've got, reducing your K-3 class sizes, depending on your certain formulas on how you're eligible for that. You get money to reduce your class size if you have a lot of at-risk kids. And same with early reading intervention programs. There's formulas there in algebra readiness. Those are some of the biggest non-SOQ formulas. Many of them are directed to at-risk students. So now, lastly, look at my time here. We've got a little time. I want to make sure you all understand the composite index. This goes back to a certain degree to what Dr. Roza talked about leveling the amount of funding going to those school divisions which have the least ability to pay. And so the numerator is supposed to be it's supposed to represent how you raise taxes, how you raise revenue in your locality. So 50% is your true value of real estate. 40% is, well, first let me talk about the 10% is taxable sales, and that relates to your local option sales tax, how much money you get from that. And then lastly, it's 40% of your Virginia adjusted gross income, which is representing all the other tax sources you have in a locality. Let's say meals taxes, tangible personal property, all the other taxes, your hotel taxes. That's supposed to be represented by your resident Virginia adjusted gross income, which is put on your tax return. So that's the numerator. That's divided by 2/3 of your school kids, your ADM, your public school kids, and 1/3 population. So that determines what your local composite index is. Now, the most important factor in reality, and this is just pure math, is how many school kids you have. So if you're losing kids at a faster rate than the state, for example, or if you're even growing slower than the state is growing on average, your LCI by that factor is going to go up. If your denominator is not growing as fast as the state, your local comp will go up. It's the opposite on the numerator. If you're growing faster, if you're looking like you can raise more revenue because you've got more valuable real estate than the state is on average is growing, or your incomes and your tax returns are growing faster than the rest of the state is growing, your composite index is going to go up because you're looking wealthier. So if I'll give you an example, if you are a locality that has, like, let's say, I don't know if it's Albemarle, but let's say Charlottesville, your Virginia adjusted gross income grew way faster than the state. You can see Albemarle here. In the most recent composite index change for the next biennium, Albemarle and Charlottesville went up 7.5 points and 5 points. Well, their AGI grew way faster. They must have had some rich people move into their locality because it grew way faster than the average state grew. And then their school kids were dropping a little bit. They weren't growing, or they lost school kids. Both of those factors drove up their composite index. And if you're a locality like that, then that's why it goes up. And vice versa, you'll go down if you're looking poor in your numerator, or you can even be a locality that is growing faster in students, and that will drive your composite index down. That's example would be Loudoun, not here, but over the years, Loudoun school kids have been growing faster than the state by far, even faster than their wealth. So their composite was slightly going down because they were getting so many school kids into their system. And so that would drive their composite index down. And here's some examples. I don't go. And what these numbers are here are the percent of state. So take a look at Charlottesville. You'll see their percent of state for Virginia adjusted gross income went from 0.5%, 0.5355% to 0.694%. That's a huge increase for small localities in that numerator. It drove the weighted average of their numerator up from 0.61 to 0.668. So even though their denominator stayed sort of level, because they had such a huge increase in VAGI, it drove their composite index from 0.69 to 0.77. And this numerator denominator ratio, if this numerator is the same as the denominator, the ratio is 1:1, you would have a 0.45 LCI. That's, remember, the average state LCI is 0.45. The average for each, across the state is 0.4, but everyone's above or below that. And that's how you kind of calculate that. Is you look at your percent of state and how it moves in relation to every other locality. And this is a simple way of looking at what the percent of state is, and you can see how it moves. It's complicated, but that's how the state determines what your share of the standards of quality you have to pay, as well as those other incentive and lottery programs are. And it moves over time, these indicators, and as they move, it changes your LCI. JLARC did recommend some changes. They recommended using a 3-year moving average to smooth large changes. If you had somebody moving in, Warren Buffett moving into your locality, that would change that VAGI component drastically. And that's probably what happened to Albemarle, Charlottesville. Someone moved in, or they had some huge capital gains that occurred in a year. And so it showed up on their tax return. Well, they said, we're going to smooth it. And they also want to replace the numerator with a more disaggregated model of all your taxes, not this TVRE, VAGI, and taxable sales, but put a disaggregated model, all the tax sources in that numerator. So that was their their improvement to the LCI if they continue to move that. And one final note there is that would be an issue. Moving to a student-based model is, as Dr. Roza described, how you come up with sort of that leveling, you know, for those districts that aren't as wealthy as others, how do you level that with taxes? And she kind of described sort of what other states do to do that, but it is to a certain degree similar to the LCI, but there's different ways of doing it, of how you level the amount of state aid for poor and localities that don't have the same ability to raise revenue for their students to come up to that amount of needed funding on the student-based model. So that's my summary. I think I kept it fairly short.
Thanks.
I have some slides here about a foundation funding approach as well that we developed myself back 20 years ago. And so I've been thinking about this for a long time. So it's kind of interesting that it's really coming to a head right now. And then I had some charts on the introduced budget, and you can look at that at your leisure and what the governor has actually proposed. And it kind of relates back to what I was saying on how, you know, the General Assembly can change, and the governor can propose, and the General Assembly can change different staffing standards, different types of ways of changing our staffing based model. And it comes up every General Assembly year, different proposals. So,
Well, Jim, thank you. I know we've got about 3 minutes left. Let's see if there's a few questions. I know, Dr. Roza, you wanted to make one comment, I think, from Jim's presentation. So let you make that comment, and then we'll see if there's any questions for Jim, and we'll wrap up.
Yeah, well, so a student-based model obviously is a lot simpler. Like, all the slides go away with all the different formulas and adjustments and all these things. It's really like, how many kids do you have, which type, and here's the amount of money. And the states that have adopted it, which is most, have essentially made the formula count all the money. And it's not like a two-tiered system where the state gives you this amount and then districts go out, collect separate amount and pay for, you know, their own assistant principals and everything. They basically said that is a recipe to keep the formula always inadequate. So what we want to do is count all that money and level all districts up to those higher amounts. And how do we get the money to do that? So that's a big piece with this. And then you don't have to do all these micro adjustments on you know, sort of changes with tax rates and things like that. Because if your tax revenue goes up at a specific tax rate, that affects the amount of state money you get, and you're still at that full dollar amount, regardless of all these other micro changes. So I think they feel like it's a lot more stable over time and more predictable. There's not these questions about how much money you're getting.
I have a question, Dr. Roza. What happens if you're a division that wants to spend a lot more money than that student-based amount? What happens then in these states?
Well, essentially, right now, a lot of places would like to spend more, but they can't raise it because they maybe don't have as high a tax rates. And so the idea is to put everybody on a level footing so that every district with the same amount of tax rate could get to the same target. So when I showed the one slide, the first slide that says, we're going to create an expectation for some tax rate, and then we'll level up. And then mostly they say after that, and then if you want to tax yourself more, we will make sure you have a guaranteed yield per pupil. So that if you're a wealthy district, you can still tax yourself more, but if you're a low property wealth area, then you would get, if you decided to tax yourself more, the same yield out of that. So there's really, that's where the equity effects come in. There's a lot of leveling up in terms of money, and we sort of lose all these pages and pages and pages of formula details. So everybody knows exactly what the dollar amount is they're getting.
But how do you deal with cost of living? There's huge cost of living differences in Virginia.
Yeah, I mean, a few states have a cost of living factor, but what we're also finding is that in some lower cost of living areas, they're also having a hard time attracting and retaining staff, even though they have lower cost of living. Like, people don't want to live there. So we see a mix. Some are just watching their ability to hire across communities. Some places, even though they have a high cost of living, still have a nice ability to attract and retain teachers, other ones not so much. And then you'll see an adjustment that can be done with the cost of living, including in that extra tax amount. So I think different states make different choices based on what the data say about access to labor.
Yeah, this is so fascinating. Obviously, it's so complex. We're not going to get all of it solved today, but we've got a lot of information that both of you have given us. And this is really just the beginning of the conversation. So we'll be sure these slides get out. We'll be sure to follow up with superintendents and make sure that this is just the beginning. And then again, if the General Assembly, as it's currently discussing in the budget language, starts to have a work group to look at this, we will be asking, as we already have, for direct participation and involvement in this. You know, Dr. Roza, I think just Jim's thing, maybe to wrap up, just a final comment. Some divisions have been going exceeding that local effort, if you will. That's what we're calling it in Virginia. What has happened in many states? Have many localities really had to step up, or is it the state that has really stepped up in this additional revenue coming in? Or has it really been different based on the unique characteristics of every state? Who's really anteing up? Because some of the highest performers are going to continue to want to do more than whatever the final rate is. That's just somewhat of the human nature, maybe, of school divisions. But has it been the locality or the state that's had the big lift in more money having to come out?
So essentially, where like on average, it's been a combination of both. And
Okay.
on average, essentially, there is a state recognition of what a lot of districts are already paying, and we try to bring that into the formula and level up to that certain amount. And there's wiggle room to raise more if you choose, but you're seeing less of those extreme disparities because you've done so much leveling up and used and really started to recognize, because in other states, sometimes the places spending the most are the ones without high needs kids, and that creates these within state disparities that can be problematic over time. So most states that have adopted a new formula have also chosen to put more money in it over time. It's more rational, and it seems more equitable, and it seems more transparent. So they're more likely to fund it.
Yeah, I saw Kathleen just put in a thing. Have some localities actually decreased their funding as a result of the state aiming up more, or have you not seen that happen?
Well, where we've seen more formula changes, it seems that the legislature is maybe more optimistic, at least in the short run, and willing to fund it.
Okay.
And then where you see, because there are a few states like Nevada and Utah, and I put Virginia in one of those categories that have been historically low spending states, and the complexity has been a barrier. So people need to agree on what we're going to spend the money on versus saying, our kids need more money, so let's put the money out there on behalf of the kids.
Yep. And I know we've reached our hour and 4 minutes over. So to respect everyone's time, what's clear is there's definitely more interest to learn more about all of this. So we'll work with our VASS team to figure out what next steps are. And we'll talk to Dr. Coons as well about what we can do to continue to have this conversation really throughout this year. So I hope, Dr. Roza, you'll be willing to come back and, as you mentioned, do a Q&A. And Jim, thank you too. I mean, that is the best 20 pages of slides of our current system that I've ever seen. I know our superintendents will really appreciate it. So let's thank everybody via chat, Dr. Roza and Mr. Regimbal for their time today. And this is the beginning, not the end of the journey. And we really appreciate everyone's time, and we'll follow up soon. These slides will go out today, as Amy said, and then we'll have them in the Wednesday newsletter as well, and more to come very soon. So thank you again, and have a wonderful day, everybody.
You take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.